You are listening to Creativity in Healthcare, hosted by Dr. Matthew J. Taylor, editor of the textbook Fostering Creativity in Rehabilitation. In this podcast, we explore creativity as it relates to how you can foster your own creativity and that of your related healthcare organizations. Healthcare reform hasn't happened yet, but working together, let's explore how we can nurture the next new growth in healthcare delivery.
Welcome to Creativity in Healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Taylor, and today's our first interview-based show where we explore creativity and why it's critical in healthcare today. Today's show is a two-part interview with Dr. Alfonso Montuori, my former dissertation chair and a leader in creativity research. These two shows will lay a foundation of understanding by giving you the context of what creativity is and how it fits in all of our modern lives. First, let me read you a bit about Alfonso. He's an educator, consultant, and musician. His transdisciplinary research is focused on the application of creativity research and complexity to better understand how to live in a complex, pluralistic, and uncertain world. Sounds a bit like our healthcare environment, doesn't it? Dr. Montuori is a graduate of the University of London, the Monterey Institute of International Studies, the Saybrook Institute, and he was a distinguished professor at the School of Fine Arts in Miami University in Ohio. In 1985 and 86, he taught at the Central South University of the People's Republic of China. His books include Evolutionary Competence, From Power to Partnership, which he co-authored with Isabel Conti, Creators on Creating, which he edited with Baron and Baron, and Social Creativity, Volumes 1 and 2, which he co-edited with Ron Purser. In 2006, he was named the San Francisco Library Laureate. He's translated several books and also consults with businesses on leadership, creativity, and innovation, to include Procter & Gamble, Pacific Bell, the U.S. Department of Labor, Progressive Insurance, and many others. We touch on music in the interview, but he forgets to mention he continues his passion of music through his collaboration with his wife, jazz singer Kitty Margolis, as the producer of her award-winning recordings and contributes as a tenor sax player. He's also a voting member of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, which we know as the Grammys. So let's meet this fascinating gentleman from his home in San Francisco by hearing his answer to my question about the influences that led to his current expertise in creativity.
Yeah, so my parents were diplomats, and so we lived in a number of different countries. We lived in the Middle East, in Greece, and then in London for many years. And then I moved here to go to school and to go to graduate school. Went to China for a year, came back, and then got married and decided this was a good place to stay.
Sure.
And during that time in London, yeah, as you mentioned, I played in a band, and I really thought my life was going to be as a musician. And I think that experience of living in a number of different countries and making music was really key for me in many ways, because I see that it still sort of informs a lot of what I'm thinking about and what I'm researching. So this experience of living in a pluralistic world where there are just a lot of different perspectives. You know, you live in different cultures, you move around, and you see that everybody sort of seems to construct a different understanding of the world. You know, while there may be some sort of values that we all share, you know, it's like kind of like cooking. You know, with the same ingredients, people make very different things and value very different things. And so that's been, and particularly the focus on the creativity that emerges in the interaction of all these different perspectives has been very important for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in addition to your teaching work, you also consult with businesses, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
one of the things that I enjoy doing very much is one-on-one coaching. So I really like working with people one-on-one and to sort of see how we can best develop their potential, get closer, a better sense of what they really care about, what's meaningful for them in their lives. And as you know, it's life these days has become sort of very rushed, and we've moved into this sort of 24/7 culture where you can receive a text at 9 o'clock at night and from your boss or whoever, and you still respond to it, right?
oh yeah.
I mean, I
Yeah.
remember the old days. I remember when my dad used to come home from work. That was it. I mean, if you ever got a phone call, it was because the office was on fire or something.
Right.
But there was just that clear demarcation of those spaces, and that's all changed. And I think people are rushing a lot more. There were a lot more connected, which is wonderful. But we're also in a situation where it's harder to let go, and it's harder to stop and pause and think, okay, well, am I going in the right direction? Is this making sense? Am I making the right choices, or am I just running?
Yeah. Yeah.
No?
And so one of the concerns people have when we bring up the idea of creativity in healthcare is that they get this like willy-nilly sitting in the artist studio, anything goes, and Andy Warhol and whatever. So I wonder, maybe share with the audience some of the clients you work with, so that people get a sense of that this is something major groups are looking at versus just an individual coaching, if you would.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I think our understanding of creativity has changed a lot just over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, when I started doing this kind of work, when I would tell people that I was researching creativity, when I was doing consulting, a lot of people still thought creativity was just something weird and odd, and you couldn't really study it because it was so unpredictable, and it was associated with wacky artists and things like that. And I think now we're beginning to have a very different kind of understanding of creativity. In the old days, the who of creativity was the genius, always a little wacky. You had the figure Einstein or Van Gogh cutting his ear off and all this sort of thing. And I think now we're realizing that anybody can be creative. That doesn't mean that you're going to develop a new theory of relativity or some kind of huge contribution to the world, but we can all be creative in our everyday lives. The how was this light bulb, right, that goes on in the cartoon character's head. And now we're seeing that creativity is, in fact, a much more process that goes on over a considerable period of time, that requires preparation, that requires thought and work, and it's not just sort of this moment of insight. There's a lot more in it, because we can all have great insights, but that doesn't necessarily even mean that anything is going to happen. I think a lot of people have worked in organizations where they've had insights about we could make things better, and we all know the kind of resistance that can create.
Yeah, and so and some of the
yes,
people you work with then are, I mean, you're talking with government agencies, you're talking with Fortune 500 type companies. This isn't just individual coaching that you do.
Oh no, yeah, right. So there's a lot of that too with companies that really are understanding that creativity isn't necessarily just about creating a new product or something like that. But we are in this transitional time. We are in this time that some people have called post-normal, just because it seems like there's an old world that's not working anymore, and we're finding our way into a new world which hasn't quite materialized yet.
Right.
And so it's a time of confusion, and particularly I think people are starting to realize that creativity isn't just about new products, but it's also about what does it mean to be a corporation right now? What kind of a business are we in? What is it that we're doing? You've got living in San Francisco. I surrounded by Airbnb and Twitter and
Uber and
Uber, exactly. And
yeah,
and Uber is the biggest sort of taxi company in the world, but it doesn't actually own any cars.
right,
Airbnb, doesn't own any buildings.
right,
And it's this huge company that, you get in touch with if you want to stay with people. So the whole thing is changing. And so creativity is also just about how you respond to a changing world.
right. And I think that's the focus of this series on creativity in healthcare, because we're standing in it.
Right.
The adoption in the U.S. with the Affordable Care Act, but also just the way literally our science of understanding health is in a huge flux too. And so that would be part of that post-normal, that what we thought was going to be predictable, what we thought was going to generate kind of that linear mechanistic do this to get this, and
Right.
that simplification of life is now in this
Exactly.
post-normal time. Anybody owning a yellow cab medallion is wondering what happened to my my future, right?
Exactly. And somebody can snap it up right away. I'm looking at this funny little thing here. It says, Uber, the world's largest taxi company, owns no vehicles. Facebook, the world's most popular media owner, creates no content. Alibaba, the most valuable retailer, has no inventory.
Yeah,
Airbnb, the world's largest accommodation provider, owns no real estate.
right. And yeah, and I think maybe that's great, because I think you could add then healthcare providers can't do much to change healthcare unless they get creative and create an environment for the client to be able to create for themselves a healthier lifestyle. And
Right.
right,
Right.
and so
Right.
yeah, so that's kind of curious. Whereas before it was just kind of the factory model. You show up at the door, get processed through the whatever that healthcare intervention is, and
Right.
now we realize, oh well, if Walgreens is still going to sell cigarettes, or how do we change health when we've got all these complex issues, which I think kind of walks us into, I would guess, one of I'm sure your major intellectual influences, and that would be, of course, Edgar Morin and his whole integral education and perspective. And so I know that's not someone in healthcare most people are familiar with, but I think it really grounds how do we behave in this post-normal times. And so maybe if you could kind of share how Morin looks at both the simplification and the violence of that versus how, when we get to use some of those important lessons that he offers, how that kind of fuels or creates that groundwork for creativity.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole sort of the complexity-based approach, certainly in Morin's view, emerged because we'd found a way of understanding the world that involved sort of taking things apart in order to understand them, simplifying, isolating them. Um, in social science, we talk about isolating variables and so on. And um, but that works up to a point. And of course, the human body is an example. I mean, you can do that sort of thing with the human body, but it's
It's
a
a little more
living
complex.
body is actually different.
Right.
It's easier to do that with a cadaver, which is in fact what most medical students historically worked on.
Right.
But when it's alive, it's a process. It's changing. It's deeply interconnected. And I think that's the thing that is now so much more important, and we're really seeing that necessity now more than ever. Because even 20 years ago, there wasn't a great sense of interconnectedness the way that we have now.
Right.
Right now, I think because of everything that's happened with technology, and because there's a generation that's grown up taking that for granted, we have a much greater awareness of interdependence that ranges from just the use of technology, but into a greater appreciation of the role of interconnectedness. So, for instance, when I first started writing about the more social dimensions of creativity, Honestly, the response from my academic colleagues was not good.
Oh,
People said, "Oh, creativity is an individual phenomenon. All that social stuff that doesn't mean anything." 20 years later, people take the social dimensions for granted.
right,
And I think that's partly due because we're now so used to thinking in terms of interconnectedness.
right,
Of course, we look at creativity as an interconnected phenomenon. I mean, it makes sense, right?
right.
So I would, in the old days, when I would go to consult on creativity with uh, with with organizations, I knew that what they wanted was for me to go in there and make individuals more creative.
Yeah,
And they would say that,
right,
and I would inevitably go in there and actually do research to find out, well, what's really going on. And 99% of the time, it was actually the environment that was problematic. It's like
right. Not the people at the desks, right?
lots of people having great ideas,
Yeah.
but the organization would make it almost impossible and extremely frustrating for
Hmm.
any of them to come to fruition.
Sure.
And so I would have to sort of tell them, well, if you want to be more creative in this organization, it's not really about me going to your scientists or to your executives and giving them these tools so that they can have more great ideas. They
Right.
have the ideas. It's
Yeah.
what happens to them afterwards in the larger system that's the problem. And things are clearly changing now, where there's much more attention being paid to the kind of environment that supports creativity and so
So
on.
you
So,
are seeing that though when you're out there.
oh,
That
definitely,
yeah.
definitely.
Okay.
It's people are much more aware of it now.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And one of the big things that kind of traps healthcare, I think, rather uniquely, is this whole kind of mantra around evidence-based healthcare, which
Mm,
which has been kind of misshapen into you don't do this type of healthcare work unless you can have data to back up that you're quite certain. Again, that
right,
certainty versus the post-normal aspect.
right,
Um, and so then people worry about when you're creative, you're going to throw out this process,
right,
and you're quite big on saying no, no, all the skills and techniques of the normal times is still important stuff. And maybe I'll put up the link to you did that great piece just this week you put up about the frequently asked questions around creative inquiry.
oh, right,
I mean,
right,
because that's what we're asking. Our listeners are looking. How can I be creative? They're inquiring. What is that?
right,
And so in healthcare, we have that special niche of, well, don't do it unless you can point to an article that says it's effective.
right,
But then when you begin to look from that complexity view, you realize, oh, it's only proven for white women 50 to 60. And I've got an African American that's 25. What do I do?
right.
It's all of a sudden that simplification has fallen apart in that.
Yeah,
And so I wonder if maybe it would be helpful for our listeners to get a sense of how you talk about the old reproductive, define reproductive education versus what a academic look in a creative inquiry mode might be in this post-normal time. Because they run up with, oh my gosh, I never learned that, or we didn't do that, and now this is out here. How do I change? Because one of the things you list in that great little handout is you've got to know that that's going to create anxiety or distress, right? It's like,
right.
oh my gosh, it changed. So
Yeah.
so maybe just if you could comment a bit about that. Our what most of us grew up in healthcare, still that reproductive education, and what we might think the future might change
Right.
with it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit of sort of my own personal experience. Is that, well, the research shows that in doctoral education, 50% of the people who start a PhD don't finish it.
Whoa.
And the reason why they don't finish it, most of them, is because they don't know how to be independent researchers. In a sense, they're dependent researchers because they're waiting for the teacher to give them the answers, because they've been brought up in a system where the teacher knows the answers. And as a student, my job is to give the teacher the answer that he or she wants.
Yeah.
Right. And so increasingly, because over the last 20 years or so, with No Child Left Behind and so on, there's been an increasing focus on assessment, on standardized tests, on multiple choice tests.
College entrance.
Yes, exactly.
Hurdles.
So students who grow up in that kind of environment haven't been trained to be independent researchers. So they can't come up with topics that they care about, and they certainly don't know how to research them. And that's very problematic. Now, there's always been a response to this kind of tendency in education to focus on, let's just make sure they get the basics and all this sort of thing. But sometimes that response has gone too far the other way, right? And so it's tended to throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is what ends up being this sort of, more kind of narcissistic kind of education. Well, I'll just study what I care about, but I won't look at the stuff that I'm not interested in that looks too hard or whatever, right? That's also a problem. So that's been historically a problem for some of these sort of more alternative educational institutions over the years. But what we're getting to now is a place where we understand the value of, having a really good foundation. Right. But then on top of that foundation, we need to be able to to respond to new situations. Right. There's a wonderful model of expertise that's been developed that shows that people who are real experts at what they do have internalized all the basics, but they don't think about them every time they do them. So, for instance, you see these chess masters who play 10 people at the same time and walk from table to table, and they just make a move and they walk to another table and boom, they do another one. You think, how is that possible? Because it's not like they stand there and they think, I think I'll move my knight to... No, they just go boom, 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 boom. But it's the same way with a racing car driver or somebody who's really good at sports. They're not thinking, I think if I go past this guy and then throw the, it just happens, right?
Yeah, or the physician in the emergency
room. Or a
room,
physician, right? So it's this ability to understand in the moment, and to be able to respond, that comes from a great depth of knowledge, but then the ability to spontaneously respond to what's happening and to deal with new situations. That's what we need now. So it's in fact a much more complex way of knowing. Yes, it means that we have to work hard to get the basics, but then on top of the basics, we need to be able to respond creatively, because a physician surely comes across situations that are unexpected quite often. And increasingly we're coming across situations that, they're not in any textbook, they're not planned for. So we have to be able to deal with that.
And that whole process of that kind of siloed education has literally created the kidney department, the liver department, everybody's literally in their own hallways. And I had a patient yesterday who was having some trouble with her kidneys and ureter and all that sort of thing. And so she finally got an appointment with the kidney doctor, and he said, I think it's in your ureter, which is the little tube off of the kidney. And she said, okay, what are we going to do about it? Well, I don't deal with that. You'll have to get an appointment with the urologist, because there's it's like, what? But I mean, and that's kind of an extreme example, but so what you're saying is we need that solid, what I think you refer to as domain practice. What's that whole foundation of that was largely built up in the normal times, right? But then now, in my case, in rehab, we see people that are 75 years old that have a multitude of things that 25 years ago, they'd be about at the end of their life, but now they're figuring they got 10 to 15 more years.
Right.
So we have to deal with diabetes, hypertension, had a stroke, bad knee, So our rehab students come out there and they go, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to know the answer, because as you said, that's how we've trained them in school, right? Get the right answer.
Right.
And so they get to that place of not knowing, and what have you seen as people's reaction when they get to that? I think you talked about that anxiety that it develops to get to some spot, or to provide an answer.
Right. I mean, I think we've historically been, as students and in general, been taught that you have to have the answer, and you have to have the right answer, and that precludes also the possibility of saying, well, we'll have to look into this and get a better understanding. And to come back to the point that you made earlier, I mean, I had actually an experience with my wife when something was, if an X-ray spotted something in her lung, and she literally went to 5 different specialists. Each specialist suggested a different operation. Each one would be, sort of
Big.
dramatic.
Yeah.
And in the end, we had no idea what to do.
Sure.
Because every single one of these highly rated and honestly really wonderful people was concerned and said, well, we have to do this. And one of the funny end of the story in a way is when we were talking to a nurse while we were waiting to see another doctor. And she said, a couple of years ago they started doing those full body scans, and the one thing we learned from that, she said, is, boy, people have a lot of crap in their lungs. And we thought, wow, maybe this is just crap.
Right.
If you'll forgive the language.
The
and it's a technical term.
Yeah.
I don't want to confuse you. But we waited for 6 months, and the crap didn't get any bigger. Well, actually, we waited for 3 months, and it didn't get bigger. But but the interesting thing was, it was the nurse that had a different kind of perspective. So in terms of what you're saying now, one of the things that's really sort of hot along with the innovation is the realization that we can't live in these silos anymore. And people need to have a broader understanding of how things are connected, because otherwise you get these piecemeal approaches where you have 5 different brilliant people, but they're suggesting 5 different radical and operations that you would do your best to avoid, and you leave the poor patient wondering, what in God's name am I going to do now?
Yeah, taking their power away too. I mean, they have the power to make an informed decision because of the complexity.
Exactly. So this is one of the big topics right now in research and academia: interdisciplinarity, or even transdisciplinarity. How do we weave this knowledge? We've all developed such incredibly powerful, specialized knowledge, and that's great. But how do we weave it back together so we can make sense of the whole and not just the parts? That's a really hot topic.
Right. And our listeners need to understand, we don't know yet, right? I mean, we have some ideas, but we don't.
We don't know yet, and it has to be done differently in every case, And we also have to break down that split that's historically been between theory and practice. So the way that you weave that knowledge together then has to be grounded both in theory and in practice. So there's this constant dialogue, and you have to constantly connect. So it's exciting, but it's also the beginning of something very new.
Right. Exactly. And then in our textbook we did together, we talked about rehabbing rehab, right? I mean, we realize it because so many of my colleagues are burned out, and it's even worse in certain medical professions and nursing professions. Carrie Clark, my classmate and your student, she's doing such a great job of bringing this conversation forward in what's happening in the nursing culture.
Right.
So I wonder, when we talk about looking at creativity and looking at this integral or transdisciplinary way of, holding everything you just described there, what are the benefits for people that can do that? What's, when we talk about transformation, what transforms for the person? What have you seen in your experience, in students and that once they kind of begin to get their chops on being okay not knowing, those kind of things. Why would our listeners want to look more into this issue? Basic marketing. What's the benefit for me, right? See,
Right. Well, I can approach it from any number of different areas. There are. I think just to bring it to a very personal level, typically we thought of the importance of information, and we thought of the importance of knowledge, but now I think by bringing all these elements together, we're also starting to look for a degree of wisdom. So it's not just, do I have enough information? Because I remember as a young person going to a library where I had to get little cards out and give them to somebody who would then order a book. And these lengthy processes where it would take forever to get a book. And now all I have to do is, the information is there. It's just mind-boggling how much information we have at our fingertips. And so I think we're moving to a different step where now we're thinking, well, how can I act wisely with that information? And I think really, when I go to a medical practitioner, when I go to a healer of any kind, I don't just want somebody who is completely on top of the latest research. Yes, that helps. But I also want somebody who has a certain degree of wisdom. And in some ways that goes back, to the image of the old, GP who used to come and to, make house calls, right? I actually remember that. Way back,
when we were boys.
But I remember that. And of course, one of the things that you would love about the great GP was the fact that it was a person with a degree of wisdom. And it's not just bedside manners, because that kind of trivializes it almost. It was like a person that you could trust to also have the big picture in mind and be able to reassure you, or to, let you know at what point, it's time to back off from the fried food here or whatever, right? Yeah. But somebody that you could trust as a person that wasn't just sort of a glorified computer, So on a very personal level, I think for our own development, I think that's a worthy goal to start developing that at all levels of society. We want that in our politicians. In politics, one of the big problems we've seen in foreign policy is that it's important, for instance, to have an understanding of the different cultural backgrounds of the places that we're dealing with.
Would be helpful.
Very often we haven't had that. We haven't had people who speak Arabic, and so it's tricky to get a sense of how to best act in particular areas when you don't really have a sense for the culture. And so we need people who are more rounded in that sense, who can then refer to specialists, but act in such a way that is wise and informed more globally, rather than just leave everything in the hands of specialists.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and so that tension between generalist and specialist, and I think we kind of joked about this transdisciplinary degree that we got at the California Institute there where you teach, is that it was a degree in context. You've got doctors of context.
Context.
If you don't understand where the context is, why,
right.
Why is Millie going on and on about her cat? Well, it's because her ankle's not working and she can't get down to the basement to get what I mean. If we don't have that broader vision or that wisdom to understand that that's Millie's real need, not some other she doesn't care about those last 3 degrees of range of motion as a data point, right? So
there you go.
Yeah, and in your frequently asked questions about that creative inquiry, you talked about intrinsic motivation too, because like you said, we have this. We can do anything now. We got all this data. We can be whatever. We're overloaded. So, what I thought was interesting was this intrinsic motivation, that thing, that passion within us, I guess we might say, that when we look at what motivates rats to create neuroplastic change after we've given them a stroke, the number one behavioral signal, the thing that will create the most change, both literally, structurally in their brains, but also behaviorally as far as the way the brain works, is salience or interest. And so I wonder if you might talk about how when you're talking to your students or you're out consulting, how do you guys assess or help people get that sense of intrinsic motivation, the thing that really generates interest? You and I are both lucky because I think we've kind of found ours, but in this state of flux when everything's changing and people go, well, what really matters? What do I really care about? You have any sense?
That's a great question, and one that we deal with in our doctoral program, as you know, and that I also deal with my consulting clients, because our educational system doesn't nurture our intrinsic motivation. In other words, it's not about supporting you in your passion.
Right.
Most people, that famous Ken Robinson YouTube, the TED Talk, do schools kill creativity? And the answer is, of course they do. Unfortunately, but they do. They and what they take away is that passion for learning and that passion for not always, of course. I don't. But the system is structured in such a way that typically we have some great teachers, and then the rest of the system conspires to take it away. So both in my consulting and in my teaching, one of the things that I really stress is the importance of giving people the time to get back in touch with what they really care about. And one of the things that you'll find often is that, you'll say, well, what do you really want to do? And they'll say, well, I want to do this. And then, that's not really what they want to do. But deep down, they're thinking, yeah, but I can't possibly do the other thing that I really want to do. That's just crazy, or they won't let me, or that won't be okay. And that's sort of what you want to get to at a certain point. Because, it might be crazy, but it's also crazy to live a life doing something that you don't care about if there's the opportunity to try something different. Right. At least give it a go,
Yeah. And I mean, like you said, it doesn't have to be big, but when you read off that list of Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, those are crazy ideas.
Those are crazy ideas.
Yeah, and so that's the other part of this, I think, is, and again, I saw you post something about this just the other day, is this idea of the one passion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We've kind of got, okay, now I'm going to be creative, so I have to figure out the one thing I really wanted. And talk about what you think
I
about
think that's
that.
Fascinating. I mean, it started to bug me after a while, because I would come across all these different books and workshops about find your true calling, as if it were somehow predestined or whatever. And I'm not sure I believe in all of that. I mean, I look at my wife; she's a jazz singer. She was born to be a singer, and yeah, definitely there are people who have this sort of, this is what you were born to do, but definitely not everybody is like that. And having said that, my wife wasn't just born to be a jazz singer. So I think this idea that somebody had already, there's something in your DNA that says, I'm going to be, the greatest chiropractor. It's like, I'm not sure that kind of thing is built into your
Right.
DNA.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So,
uh,
so exploring what those aspects are that jazz you about that, to use a bad pun, but yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of. I think there are. I think we just need to become more aware of what has meaning for us,
yeah,
and what we really enjoy doing.
right. Because you have your horn, you're still playing your saxophone, right?
Still doing that, yeah.
Yeah, and your consultancy, your education, and you guys obviously enjoy fine food, definitely foodies. Not because of your
Right.
stature, but because of seeing the food post.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I wonder. So, when we look at what are the things that give us passion, what are we jazzed about? Then, when I get back to that research thing, and you touched on this, is that break between theory and actual practice, right? And that was probably one of the huge things that I took away from my experience there at the school, was the whole concept of action research as a way we can make changes in community, when we start to see people actually doing things locally. I'm interested in yoga. What happens when I offer a yoga class at my physical therapy clinic, and people show up, and then they get to hear, oh, I've got a backache too, and you've got this, but it begins when we take the work out in a new form, or as action. Get a group of people with a common problem, and then start to make changes.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big things the school does there, is set an example for different ways that we can think about knowing. Rather than knowing the answer, why don't we get together and work together? Is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's you expressed that very eloquently. I mean, so I think sometimes we feel that, well, the world's problems are so big. Well, what can I do? Just little old me here. And then yet, when you see what happens when even a very small group of people get together, we're not going to change the whole world. We wouldn't even know where to begin, right?
Right.
And
Wouldn't want to, because
wouldn't
we probably
want to,
screw it
right?
up, right?
Exactly. But it is possible to get together with people and to make really significant changes, to do different things, to create a new university, to create a center where people use alternative healing. I mean, or Uber and Airbnb and Facebook. I mean, it's just a bunch of, in those cases, it's just a bunch of kids getting together, and really changing things around. I mean, who would have thought that the hotel and the taxi business would be shaking in their boots, right?
Yeah.
It's very strange. Or that there would be no more bookstores, really, which I think is a disaster,
Yeah, I don't know.
right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think there is something wonderful about people coming together and really working towards uh, a meaningful goal.
Yeah,
And
and
that's obviously something that you've done in your community. I mean, you can make and the beautiful thing now is that with all this technology, if you're doing this, even you don't have to do it in New York or Los Angeles. You can do it wherever you are, and people can find out about it.
right. Yeah, and then it
People are
gets
finding out about things that people are doing in remote villages,
right. Yeah, so it's
because
very
every
exciting.
people are increasingly connected, and so that information can spread now. So that's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's not just then making that small difference in your community or a big difference in your community, but the model can inspire people across the planet. So that's
Right.
really exciting.
Yeah, there's that whole scalable boom, viral
Right.
aspect of what we see. And so
Exactly.
as we kind of come towards the close here, I just happened to hear an interview by Krista Tippett, that On Being. She has an On Being podcast, and she was interviewing Mary Catherine Bateson, who was one of the authors we had to read when went through your program. And I think it was Unveil. What is it? Do you remember her book, Unveiling, or which? Anyway, she's got a new book out, which I think was really interesting in the way our conversation went today, because she did a book about creating or composing
composing a life,
composing a life, and now she's got a new one out, composing a further life, active wisdom. And so I think a lot of our listeners are probably in the realm where we are, where she talks about, we've had childhood, adulthood, and old age. But since World War II, we've inserted another 20 to 30 year period, which she's calling adulthood 2. You kind of got your chops in your profession. You kind of got set somewhat financially, or got the kids out of the house or whatever. But now we've got this period where nobody's ready to retire. So we've got this incredible storehouse of creative possibility.
Right.
And I think that's a great resource for people to look at, because she puts language to kind of what we knew was going on. And that's what happened when I went through the program there. It was like I understood everything was different, and things weren't predictable anymore. And then to get that structure really, really helps. So I'm curious to hear, kind of as we close up here, what are you doing with the leadership program you're doing there, or what's on your creative table at this point, or what do you see coming in the future for you?
Oh, well,
in your active wisdom.
Yeah. Well, one of the things actually that I want to research more is this notion of wisdom, and how, like creativity, we can take it from something that's just, like this exceptional gift, into something that we can grow into and learn about and develop. So I've been, as you know, writing a lot of articles, and one of the things that I want to do is I think I'm ready to put together a couple of books, and one of the things that I want to do is articulate this perspective on creative inquiry and transdisciplinarity, because I think as we are in this transitional phase, the old structures are crumbling, but we need to, as you said, have language for where we're going, and also make sure we don't fall into the traps of the old ways of thinking.
Right.
And so sort of a way to make us avoid some of the traps that we've gotten into as we start building this new world, right?
Gotta keep self-reflecting and looking back, right? Or looking in and back.
Exactly, and history is important. I mean, I think it's important to understand, particularly in this time of transition. It's important to understand where we've come from. I think that's one of the things that people like so much about that show, Mad Men.
No. Sure.
I mean, when you watch Mad Men, you get a sense for a completely different world, and the show itself was about that transition from the 60s with the suit and the tie and the hat and a certain, and the cabinet with the drinks in the office, right? And everybody smoking, and I think a lot of people looked at that and went, "Wow, that wasn't that long ago in the end, really." I mean, It may seem to the young people that it was forever ago, but it wasn't really that long ago when you look in terms of the impact that these changes have had and how we're still dealing with them.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand the history, where we've been, and what we can learn from that, and also what we can make sure we don't do again.
Right, repeat those mistakes. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to reading that book, so we better let you get back to work.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, but if our listeners want to know more about what you do in that, I know you're on academia.edu, right?
Sure, or they can just go to my website, evolutionarystrategies.net.
Oh, great. Okay.
And
we'll get that on there. Yeah. So thanks so much for changing my life and getting me excited about this, but I am hoping this will do the same for our listeners, to know that we're not in this alone. We're all looking for bringing forward that better future, right?
Yeah. Always great speaking with you, Matt. Thank you.
Great to spend time with you, Alfonso. Thank you.